Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history. In the last several lectures, we've been talking about American culture in the decades following the Civil War. And in this series of lectures, we're going to be looking at one particular aspect of American culture in that era, and that is the rise of sport in America. The sporting experience in America between 1850 and 1920 was not democratic. It was very much a product of class. Class was determined primarily by wealth, but also involved occupation, religion, race, ethnicity, and residency. And the lines between sporting activities of these classes, while somewhat flexible, were also remarkably rigid. That is, members of the working class only had limited access to sports of the middle class, if any access, and those in the middle class had little to no access to sports of the upper class. And there might even be further gradations within the different classes, particularly the upper class, which we'll talk about shortly. The top 5% or so of the nation consisted of the upper class. These were primarily white, native-born Americans, but all had considerable wealth. Beneath them were the middle class, and we've talked about the rising middle class in some previous lectures. They made up about 30 to 40% of the country at this time, and were predominantly white and native-born. The working class, which consisted of 50 to 60% of the population, were primarily urban. These were lower class, blue-collar workers, largely immigrants and their children. We're going to start by talking about sport of the upper classes. And actually, as we begin, we're going to talk about some of the activities of the elite, starting with yachting. The New York Yacht Club became one of the social centers of the New York elite, and men such as Cornelius Vanderbilt and John J. Astor joined the club to solidify their social status. Yachting was the ultimate sport of the super rich. Membership in the club, the time and travel required, and of course the boats themselves, ensured that even regular upper-class types couldn't participate. Only the super rich competed in these events, and it was as much about the show as the sporting contest itself. The bigger the boat, the better the equipment, the higher your status. And again, this could really be a mark of elite wealth. As J.P. Morgan once said, "You can do business with anyone, but you can go sailing only with a gentleman." One of the exemplars of this upper-class lifestyle was James Gordon Bennett, Jr., who was the son of a Scottish immigrant who founded the New York Herald and became a newspaper mogul. Sr. wasn't so much interested in sports, but he became incredibly wealthy and passed on a great deal of that wealth to his son, Gordon Bennett, Jr. In fact, the father gave Bennett, Jr. a 70-foot yacht for his 16th birthday. Bennett won the first transatlantic yacht race in 1866, though it was said he did little more than drink on deck while his crew did all the real sailing. By the time Bennett was 26 years old, his father had handed over control of the Herald to him, and he ably ran the newspaper and expanded its fortunes. He was fascinated with sports and other exploits. He sponsored all kinds of expeditions, explorations of the planet, and also races in things like ballooning, yachting, early automobile races, airplane racing, soccer, and other events. He was an avid sportsman himself, particularly enjoying horse racing and carriage riding, which he often did at a breakneck pace and often without any clothes on. Bennett also built the Newport Casino Club, which became a hub for sports like tennis and polo, and ultimately was the site of the first U.S. Open tennis tournament, and which now is the home of the International Tennis Hall of Fame. Upper-class sports provided an opportunity for the wealthy to separate themselves from the masses, as well as to be conspicuous consumers, such as Bennett. And in the case of people like Bennett, it offered an opportunity for the super wealthy to separate themselves from just the run-of-the-mill wealthy. Sport also provided an opportunity for upper-class men to prove their masculinity and manliness, which we discussed at some length in the previous lectures. In the Victorian era, manliness had suffered as more and more men were working indoors and working in offices rather than engaging in rugged activities outdoors. So sports, for some such men, offered an opportunity for them to exercise their manliness. Theodore Roosevelt, who we discussed at some length in a previous lecture, exemplified that manly spirit. He had been sickly as a child, but built himself up through physical activity. While at Harvard, he boxed, rode, wrestled, among other outdoor activities. He also enjoyed swimming, mountain climbing, and big game hunting, and eventually collected for himself quite an extensive collection of squirrels and small game, and eventually large game, through his various exploits. As I described previously, in 1898 he organized the Rough Riders, a volunteer company, to fight in the Spanish-American War, which was composed largely of his college football buddies from Harvard. So the wealthy, such as Roosevelt, gathered to participate in their sports at exclusive sports clubs. Elite clubs offered them a socially segregated, non-threatening environment where the masses and lower classes were not allowed. Membership was restricted by high initiation fees and annual dues, and only by a unanimous vote could one become a member. They also achieved this exclusivity by favoring sports that required fancy equipment and heavy investment, as we've already mentioned, yachting, but other sports like equestrian sports, which required the purchase of horses and other equipment. Sports clubs provided a community of like-minded people with similar social origins, beliefs, values, customs, and lifestyles. It was a safe haven from the problems of the industrial city, and also a place for networking and opening doors to other elements of elite life. A small segment of the elite population continued to enjoy outdoor field sports, including big game hunting and equestrian sports such as riding, jumping, and hunting as well. The Boone and Crockett Club was limited to 100 members, including Teddy Roosevelt, and they arranged expensive wilderness trips with professional guides. In some cases, the super wealthy even bought their own expansive preserves, such as Jekyll Island along the Georgia coast, which became an outdoor sportsman's paradise. Eventually, membership in this club included a total wealth of more than $1 billion, and there was also a huge castle-like clubhouse, and the grounds featured hunting for turkey, quail, duck, deer, and wild hogs, and there was also outstanding fishing. The wealthiest of the wealthy didn't even need to go to a club. They might own their own private hunting property and massive estates. W.E.B kept a private hunting ground of 75,000 acres in the Adirondacks, which was stocked with wildlife and a huge arsenal of hunting weapons. Another focal point of elite sports were jockey clubs, associated with the horse racing fairgrounds. Opening day at these racetracks became premier social events. Think of the hats at Churchill Downs, even today, for the Kentucky Derby. The horses could cost up to $40,000 each and competed in stakes races, sometimes rewarding more than $50,000. Among the most exclusive of these clubs were Saratoga Springs, founded in 1863, and the American Jockey Club in 1865. Elites also joined high-class athletic clubs, emphasizing track and field. In 1866, 3 upper-class New Yorkers founded the New York Athletic Club. It was emulated by wealthy in other cities, and most major cities had such clubs by the 1880s. The New York Athletic Club was central to the development of track and field. In 1876, It built the first cinder track and sponsored the national championships that year. The club also established the rules of amateurism, barring those who had competed for money or prizes. Amateurism was designed to perpetuate upper-class dominance in such sports. Men who worked at sport were not allowed. True amateurs were part-time athletes only. The New York Athletic Club helped to establish the Amateur Athletic Union in 1888 and became central in preparing athletes for Olympic competition later. The preservation of amateurism and threats to it became a particularly touchy subject among elites. As one writer said, the worst attack upon amateur sport ever witnessed came from the Greater New York Irish Athletic Club, and we'll talk about ethnic clubs shortly. In 1885, the New York Athletic Club constructed a $150,000 five-story downtown clubhouse with a gymnasium, swimming pool, bowling alley, billiard room, dining rooms, wine cellar, and many other features. The club became the center of social life for many elites. Members and their wives filled their calendar with balls and feasts around various sporting events. In spite of such lavish accommodations, the downtown clubs still ranked below the clubs that I described above in terms of prestige. Still, they served as an entry point for upper to middle class or newly rich. Now, what about upper class women and their role in terms of sport? Well, while convention held that truly upper-class women didn't need to exert themselves, in fact, some of these women ranked among the first sportswomen. Elite women were above reproach. No one was going to ridicule them or question them. So for lower-class women, playing sports invited ridicule and questions about their femininity, but upper-class women at times could get away with it. While women were not welcome at the workplace or the voting booth, they were welcome at sports clubs. Generally, they were spectators and social guests, but occasionally they were also allowed to compete and participate. Sporting ventures offered women another opportunity to buy new outfits and thus demonstrate their own and their husbands' wealth. The fancier, the better. The Brooklyn Athletic Club opened its billiard and bowling facilities to women on Mondays and Fridays. Other clubs had separate tennis courts, swimming pools, and gymnasia for women. And in some cases, upper-class women organized their own clubs as well. In 1901, a group of them established the Federation of Women's Athletic Clubs. Such clubs charged lofty initiation and annual dues, securing the upper-class status of their members. Sports that women were allowed to participate in frequently included some accommodations that allowed women to participate. Just as one example, and we'll talk more about these in other lectures, but as one example, you see the women in these pictures riding their horses side saddle, as opposed to astride the horse, which was a development that would come later. But this allowed them to participate in this sport while maintaining their ladylike features. A final focal point of upper-class sporting life was the country club. The country club was modeled after the life of English gentry. These were large suburban resorts. The suburban country club represented the ultimate in elite behavior. Simply being able to travel outside of the city for leisure indicated one's rank. Neither the lower nor the middle class could typically afford the time and expense of such trips. The clubs typically were located in serene, rustic locations that took their members away from the dinginess and troubles of the cities. There was a healthy social element to activity at these clubs. It wasn't just about the sports themselves. Elite sons and daughters mingled at dances and theatrical performances, which encouraged intermarriage within the wealthy class. Elite wives joined their husbands or even retreated to the country clubs while their husbands worked for their own social interactions. The preeminent sports of the new country club set were golf and tennis. Golf was an expensive sport enjoyed by English elite, who became the role models of American wealthy people. Golf was a perfect sport for the elite. It was leisurely and took a long time. It required timing and coordination, but wasn't overly taxing. And foursomes on the golf course offered a comfortable atmosphere and became convenient venues for discussing and closing business deals. Golf was also considered appropriate for elite women because it wasn't overly taxing, and so most clubs reserved some off-peak hours for women's play. Women even established their own golf clubs at times and even had their own course, New Jersey's Morris Country Club. The Women's National Championship was first held there in 1895. Lawn tennis was another activity that was popular at the country clubs. It was also an export from Britain. Developed in 1873 in England, it was carried to Bermuda and eventually the United States. Tennis was particularly popular with the ladies. It wasn't considered a particularly virile sport. The Harvard Crimson wrote in 1878, "The game is well enough for a lazy or weak man, but men who have rowed or taken part in a nobler sport should blush to be seen playing lawn tennis." Only after the turn of the century and the introduction of the Davis Cup in 1900 did men begin to take tennis more seriously. Women played a much different brand of tennis at that time than they do today. They wore full skirts and heavy clothing, which discouraged much running or quick movements. The game was baseline hitting and not as strenuous at all as the modern game. But tennis offered a handful of women the opportunity to become known for their sporting prowess. The Bostonian woman, Eleanor Sears, is often considered the first American sportswoman. She won the Women's National Championship doubles tournament 4 times, as well as the squash championship. Sears was just as renowned for her feisty attitude and dress, wearing men's trousers, riding horseback astride, and challenging men in various contests. The elite sportswoman sparked a trend in the 1890s, the Gibson girl, who participated in cycling, golf, tennis, and horseback riding. She abandoned the corset and began to wear lighter clothing. This was the beginning of a trend away from the frail Victorian woman and towards a healthier, more athletic one. The ideal woman was becoming attractive, tall, slim, and physically fit. In our next lecture, we'll talk about sport in this same era for the middle class.